Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl. Please welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Okay, so first I emphasize that I am not presenting the Sunni perspective or representing the Shia perspective in this talk. I'm taking basically the results of my own research and studying this matter for a good part of my life. The first point for all of us to take note of is that the Sunni and Shi'i divide has ebbed and flowed in its significance throughout Islamic history. At times it was a critical sectarian divide, a serious issue of fitna, as in every sense of the word, while other times less so, and it depended on numerous factors. But in our modern age, I see this divide, especially with the power dynamics that are taking place between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the way that this divide is being exploited and manipulated in our modern age as particularly sinister and dangerous for all Muslims. And I think that it is disastrous for Muslims in the West to import some of the deeply embedded cultural animus that we see between various political parties that represent, whether for instance, the Houthis in Yemen, who are Zaydis, or Saudi Arabia, which at this point adopts Wahhabi some of the theological premises, or the Emirat, where you can't really describe the Emirat as adopting Wahhabi theological premises, but rather adopting a sort of a type of secular pro-capitalist type of ideology in its animosity. So I'll throw this in at the beginning and then talk about how the emergence of this sectarian divide in Islamic history. And again, remember that while I'll allude to what have become orthodox Sunni perspectives and orthodox Shia perspectives, I reference them as part of theological orthodoxy, while not necessarily what I would adopt as the more likely historical truth. So first and foremost, when does this divide emerge in Islamic history? And the answer is, it's not quite clear when Sunnis became Sunnis and when Shi'is became Shi'is. It is clear that they defined themselves in relation to one another. And it is also clear that by the 3rd Islamic century, so that's the 9th century. By the time that we have the 12th Imam, in Shia belief, the occulted Imam among the Jafaris, that there is a clear theological, institutional divide between what by then have become Sunni Muslims and what identified themselves as Shia Ali, or at that time were often referred to as the Alawiyin, or basically the party of Ali. Now, was that divide from a historical perspective existing before the first 300 years? Not likely. There was clearly a dynamic that has powerfully split the Ummah over a not just a political issue, but a moral issue, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But a moral / or ethical / political dispute is different than the development of an entire theological institutional divide, which takes hundreds of years before, at least the first couple hundred years, to develop and to become a staple in the way that Islam defines itself today and sees itself, or the way Muslims see Islam and represent Islam in their own actions and beliefs. Okay, so if you talk to an expert on Hadith, they'll often tell you that the divide started with an historical incident that took place over a pond of water called Khum, or the famous incidents of Ghadir Khum, where reportedly the Prophet ﷺ designates Ali as his heir, tells Ali that once I die, you will take my place as the leader of the Muslim Ummah. This is more theology than history. Whether in fact the incident of Ghadir Khum took place and what was said is highly speculative. So what was, from my perspective at least, the real issue that divided, that eventually gave birth to the Sunni-Shi'i divide? And subhanAllah, it's one of the most remarkable points in history. If you believe history to be deliberate, and that Allah manages history so that we can learn from it by reflecting upon it, I think it was one of the most powerful moral lessons for early Muslims and for all Muslim generations to follow. And that is fundamentally what to do about the corrupting power of politics, and what to do about injustice when injustice could cost you your life. So if it wasn't the Ghadir Khum or a purported historical incident where the Prophet ﷺ stops near a water hole and tells Ali, you are my wali, you are my successor. So what was the dispute about? Well, most Muslims will know that the dispute had to do with the succession of the Prophet ﷺ. And I think any historian by now will agree that after the Prophet ﷺ dies, there is a meeting where the Ansar, before, during the procession where the Prophet is being prepared for burial, the Ansar, which is, as I'm sure you remember, Medina, after the Muslims left Mecca to Medina, Medina became separated into two parties, the natives, the Ansar, and the immigrants, the Muhajirun. And after the Prophet ﷺ expended a great deal of moral and sagacious effort assimilating and integrating and reconciling the hearts of the natives to the immigrants. The Ansar and the Muhajirun, by teaching them not just what, a lesson that we need in the modern age, how do you get the natives in a country to assimilate and integrate and internalize a migrant community. Now, after the death of the Prophet, there is a critical moment in Islamic history where the question becomes, well, does the nativist movement in Medina resurface? Does Medina, now that the Prophet Muhammad is dead, does Medina split off and break off with its own leadership? Do Muslims, like we have today in the modern age, every tribe, every geographic area adopt its own leader and cooperate with one another through separate leadership, or do Muslims continue to be under an obligation to have a single leader for the Ummah? And this issue was controversial at the beginning of Islam, and today, of course, I don't need to tell you much about the way it is. Muslims have splintered into ethnic and cultural and so on. But it was a very critical, poignant issue. And the Ansar met shortly after the death of the Prophet with a very strong political movement arguing that now that the Prophet ﷺ passed away, that the Ansar should elect their own ruler, and the immigrants who now had Mecca as a Muslim city-state, that the immigrants could either go to Mecca or stay in Medina as welcome guests, but nevertheless Medina would be ruled by its own Khalifa or its own Imam. There was even a proposal that Medina should be ruled by a king, that it should have a Malik. And Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah takes wind of this meeting and sees it as extremely dangerous, alerts Umar and Abu Bakr that this nativist movement is meeting and discussing the possibility of effectively splitting the Muslim Ummah from the very beginning. And Umar, Abu Bakr, and Abu Ubaidah Jarrah go to the meeting, and effectively what all the reports say is that there is a debate. Not all of the debate is preserved. We get snippets of it, but fundamentally the thrust of the debate is that Abu Bakr and Umar and Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah convinced the Ansar, convinced the natives of Medina not to split the Ummah into a separate political entity, and in fact nominate Abu Bakr to the Khilafah, and Abu Bakr becomes the first Khalifa. Now, modern Muslims or Muslims, even centuries later, often think that the divide between the Sunni and the Shia emerged when Ali's claims to the Khilafah or entitlement to the Khilafah, depending on what you believe, whether he was in fact designated by the Prophet ﷺ, as his successor or not, was ignored. I can tell you that in my view, and this is again neither Sunni nor Shi'i, but in my view, that's more schismatics and theology than the history. The real divide, the real separation, because I think the evidence, the historical record, that even if Ali was not happy with the way that the fact that the Ansar and Umar and Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah chose Abu Bakr as the Khalifa, the historical evidence that he gave his own bay'ah, whether right away or a short while later, is quite strong. Some Shia sources insist that Ali never gave his bay'ah, but and same for his wife Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. But I think the historical evidence for that is much weaker. And I think the real separation, the real divide, is not again, from a historical perspective, is not the issue of succession immediately. I'll give you a little bit of history so we're all on the same page before I talk about what I think was the point of rupture, if you will. If you will remember, the Prophet dies, Abu Bakr becomes the Khalifa. After Abu Bakr there's Umar, and after Umar there's Uthman, and after Uthman Ali becomes the Khalifa. During Ali's Khilafah, there is effectively a rebellion by Muawiyah, and eventually an arbitration or a resolution of sorts between Ali and Muawiyah is reached. But Imam Ali is assassinated by a member of the Khawarij who is not happy about his negotiating with Muawiyah. This is just quick 101 history, so we're all on the same page. Now, after the assassination of Imam Ali, automatically the claim to Khilafah goes to his son Hassan. Am I going too fast for you?
No.
So after Imam Ali, then it goes to his son Hassan. Imam Hassan was unfortunately modern Muslims, largely because of the influence of the Wahhabi movement, in my humble opinion, don't learn a great deal about the extremely nuanced and ethical thought of Imam Hassan. Imam Hassan makes a decision that Muslims have not sufficiently studied, and that is, rather than fight Muawiyah for power, he reached a settlement with Muawiyah, per which there are several conditions to the settlement, but the most important of which is that, one, there had emerged already in Syria at this early point in Islam a tendency among the supporters of Muawiyah to demonize Imam Ali and to even require that during Jum'ah that he be cursed. Imam Hassan tells Muawiyah that as a condition for our settlement is that this practice has to stop. It's a practice that will resonate through history because what it did was that a lot of Muslim jurists or emerging Muslim jurists refused to engage in the cursing of Imam Ali, and as a result withdrew from politics and withdrew from public life. But Imam Hassan then makes an agreement with Muawiyah that I will focus on teaching, basically focus on being a scholar. I will focus on teaching and I will focus on da'wah, educating the Muslim public. I will drop my claims to power, but Muawiyah, when you die, you cannot give power to your son because power in Islam is not a matter of mulk. It's not a matter of a king giving it to his son. Muawiyah agrees to the terms. Now, the evidence is rather convincing, in my view, that eventually Muawiyah finds it, although he observes the terms of the agreement with Imam Hassan for about 10 years or so, he finds the temptation to pass power onto his son extremely powerful. His son is called Yazid. Yazid was not a very pious man by any measure. He was actually quite corrupt. That's universally agreed on by Shia and Sunni sources. And so, and again, there's plenty of evidence that Imam Hassan was poisoned by his wife, and sufficient evidence to suggest that she did the act on behalf of political authorities, Umayyad authorities. Now, why? Well, one thing, she was not punished, although some historians say, well, because although she was suspected of poisoning Imam Hassan, the punishment, the crime could not be proven. You could talk a lot about that. But anyway, her name was Jada bint al-Ashas, and Jada bint al-Ashas poisons her husband, Imam Hassan. Probably the Umayyads were behind it. But now that Imam Hassan dies, we come back to the issue of who's going to take power. Well, at this point, Muawiyah announces that it's going to be Yazid, his son, that will take power. The problem with Yazid is he's a drunkard, a womanizer, a buffoon in so many ways. And Hassan's brother, Imam Hussein, who is the Prophet's grandson, the younger, the Ali's son, Ali, the progeny from Ali and Fatima, argues that by now allowing power, by Muawiyah picking his son to rule, rather than abiding by the terms of the agreement with Hassan, that after Hassan's death, that there would be, the Ummah would choose its ruler, rather than have the ruler being decided by the political elite. Hussein is scandalized by this, and is scandalized by the fact that Yazid, in particular, would rule over the Ummah. Now, what you have to understand is that everyone, whether Sunni or Shia, agrees that at this point in history, political sympathies with Ali al-Bayt, whereas the grandsons of the Prophet ﷺ, the children of Ali and Fatima, is enormous. While the political elite is, the Meccan aristocracy, the same aristocracy that persecuted the Prophet in Mecca, is now the rulers of the first dynasty of Islam. While the Meccan aristocracy is in power, the Ummah itself in its various theological institutions, in its day-to-day operations, is widely sympathetic to Ahlul Bayt, and the real question is whether you get involved in the political dispute, in an active rebellion against the Umayyad Meccan aristocracy in power, or you let them rule and do what teach Sharia, focus on the development of the Ummah, leaving politics to the side. Anyway, Imam Hussein makes, with his supporters, make the decision that, no, if the head is corrupt, the body will be corrupt as well, and decides that Yazid cannot be in power without being challenged. This leads to probably the most traumatic and scarring event in early Islamic history, the Battle of Karbala. And it's extremely traumatic because of the slaughter of Ahlul Bayt. Even in Sunni sources, when it's reported on with a monumental amount of agony and pain. And any Islamic source, Shia or Sunni, that you read on it, it is just shocking that those in political power deemed it fit to slaughter 70 plus, 72 or 74, or depending on the source you read, or 75 members of the household of Muhammad and their supporters. And especially Imam Hussein, who was a charismatic, vibrant teacher with a lot of the figures that surrounded him. And Karbala was like a deep scar that sort of will radiate throughout the history of Islam. And it is my belief that this is when the actual rift between Sunnah and Shia starts. Now, because it was so shocking to the senses, the question then emerges immediately. What is the ethical duty of Muslims? Is it, option one is to say, this was a horrendous massacre, a profoundly disturbing event. What we learn from it is that politics is corrupting. Those who play with power are playing with fire, and so we withdraw from political life and dedicate ourselves to what effectively was scholarly activities, studying the Sharia, studying the Hadith, studying the Quran, developing the Awqaf and the seminaries and the network of charitable trusts that was so key in the Islamic civilization? Or do we insist that unless you take an ethical position about what is right or wrong and support and commit yourself to overthrowing the unethical leaders of the community, then you're effectively betraying your ummah? Now, this is a question that will confront Muslims, by the way, time and again, whether the Mongols come to power, and the Mongols were known for their remarkable corruption. They converted to Islam, but And so tons of Muslims centuries later will think about whether they must commit themselves to an agenda of rebellion. And you remember, when you commit yourself to an agenda of rebellion, you'll live a miserable life because political power goes after you. It will persecute you, it will confiscate your property, it will imprison your children. It's a tough life. It's effectively a life of martyrhood. Or do you say, well, find space where you can I always call this a devil attack.
I suggest go ahead and continue, and if there's a real issue, we'll let you know.
Yeah, you'd smell the fire by now if there was a real issue.
It's in the cafeteria, it's a smoke alarm. Continue on.
Okay. Continue it is. It's remarkable. We're just talking about danger and making critical decisions in your life. And by the way, this issue will also confront Muslims later on with colonialism. It will confront Muslims after colonialism with many authoritarian governments. What do you do when you make the type of ethical decision that could mean living a persecuted life, or you develop an accommodation with power that allows you space to do good, but ultimately you're not taking a stand on that involves speaking truth to power. Now, we use this term a lot in the modern age, but you can imagine the type of commitment it would take those who would dedicate themselves to an agenda of telling what they believed were unjust rulers, and were in fact unjust rulers, that you're unjust and that you don't represent Islam in what you do. Now, what is quite fascinating, after the killing of Imam Hussein and his supporters in Karbala, is regardless of the very high stakes to supporting, and it became the supporters of Imam Ali became somewhat of a symbolic issue in early Islamic centuries. The rebellion, those who called themselves the Alawiyin and who joined the faction of Imam Ali, and it wasn't one faction, it was various permutations of dissenters, were consistently challenging, defying Umayyad practices of injustice and meritocracy. And Hisham Ja'id has a very nice study about the way that they would consistently accuse the Umayyads of not practicing shura in the way they ruled, and that they ruled despotically, not according to a sharia or a rule of law at the time. And so basically but doing so put you on a collision course with the state, and which often meant jail, torture, and execution. And indeed, we find that for the first 300 years, whether we're talking about Ali ibn Hussein al-Sajjad, or Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, or Ja'far al-Sadiq, Musa ibn Ja'far al-Qazim, Ali ibn Musa al-Rida, Muhammad bin Ali Jawad, who's the 9th Imam, or Ali bin Muhammad al-Hadi, and even then we get to Hassan bin Ali al-Askari, and Muhammad bin al-Hassan al-Mahdi, who's supposed to be the 12th occulted Imam. All the first Imam after Imam Hussein have suspiciously died of poison. They were always poisoned, And so they die quite under suspicious circumstances. In all of them, there is never a formal inquiry. No one is ever actually charged or convicted for their poisoning. And all of them negotiated a track between outright rebellion and doing as much good as a despotic state will allow them to do. So all historical sources, whether Sunni or Shi'i, well, I think we've called the fire department on us. Okay, I'm going to continue unless they tell me to shut up. Okay, so try to picture this, because there's a lot of information and that it would take us a long time to present, but each of those first 10 or these 10 imams that are historically exist after Imam Hussein, each one of them attempts to negotiate power to the extent, to the best of their ability, between defying power by saying, we don't endorse your injustices, we don't endorse your despotism, allowing the state, with each of them, puts very severe restrictions. Some of them the state arrests and even tortures, but most of them the state limits their activity, in other words, orders them to some type of, puts restrictions on their movement, mostly in Medina, later on in Samarra, Iraq. But effectively what they spend their life doing is teaching and educating, but at the same time opposing the state's injustice and corruption. And because of their steadfast piety and vocal involvement against despotism, each one of them, eventually the state decides that they're too costly to keep alive, and eventually the state poisons them. Now, the state could not, with each of them, afford to publicly execute them, but the state would, and I encourage you to read the stories about each of these imams, because they're fascinating. It's fascinating. Their lives are remarkably educational. The way the state would come down on them and try to limit them, and they would defy the state, and back and forth until the state eventually says, that's it, do away with them. Now, here is the critical thing. When you have, there is no question whether between Sunni sources or Shia sources that each of the Ahl al-Bayt, the descendants of Hussein and Fatima or Imam Hassan, that it is no question that Ahl al-Bayt were exemplary in their ethics and in their piety. Sunni or Shia sources, they agree on this. There's no question also that they were extremely popular during the Umayyad dynasty and during the Abbasid dynasty. That is not in contention either. There is also no question that they played a critical role in setting down the Sharia as we know it. So Sharia through history. Ja'far al-Sadiq did not just educate what eventually would become the Shia. Ja'far al-Sadiq was also the teacher of Imam al-Shafi'i and Abu Hanifa, and so in other words, their impact on what we know as Islamic law and ethics is unmistakable. But the fact that each one of them lives a dramatically, powerfully tragic life left its emotional impact on the Muslim Ummah, and to sum it up in three main orientations. Orientation number one was one that simply saw the early saga of Islam as a saga of the divine will being consistently frustrated because of the corruptions of power, and that each Muslim has an ever-pending moral obligation to fight despotic power or unjust power, to challenge it, even if the cost is persecution. The second orientation thought that the tragic life of these Imams, of Ahlul Bayt especially, and is in itself immoral. The reason that Allah willed things like that is that so that it becomes a source of inspiration as to what the truly guided and truly pure and the luminous, the type of sacrifices they are willing to make for the cause of God's word, and that they are a moral and ethical example, but that you need not put yourself at risk in joining their political cause. So in other words, you don't have to rebel. I wrote a full book called The Law of Rebellion in Islam. It's a big fat book, it's very technical, that goes through all the debates about rebellion by the various Muslim factions. Do you have an obligation to rebel and place yourself in danger, or don't you? The irony is, by the time we hit the 4th century, that was the critical issue that will give birth to what will become the Shia and the Sunnah. The faction number one say, rebellion is a moral obligation. You can't just sit and create a space for your life without clearly recognizing your obligation to overthrow the unjust. Faction number two basically said power is literally a form of casting yourself onto ruin, that you don't have an obligation to challenge power when power will crush you, and that instead your obligation is to do as much good as you can. And so this is why, eventually will become the Sunnah. There's a great deal of sympathy for the Ahlul Bayt and their tragic lives. Modern Muslims don't know this, but the early classical sources are replete with various doctrine that comes from the first 12 Imams and their followers. The third group, which will have its own impact in the modern age more than in the classical age, basically de-emphasized the ethical example and saw a moral obligation to obey whoever is in power, because if they are in power, then Allah put them there, even if they're unjust. And this becomes a very strong doctrine in modern Islam, even more so than in classical Islam. In classical Islam, they were sort of the idea that despotism is part of qada, despotism is part of God's will, and so if you have a despotic ruler that takes power, then you should obey that despotic ruler, and you have a moral obligation to obey a despotic ruler, because rebellion is a moral wrong. Doesn't actually take hold as a popular idea until the modern age. And the irony is, it was first in the modern age, it was discovered by Orientalist scholars, and they found it a very convenient doctrine to anchor Orientalism in Muslim societies. And in fact, there's a very, I know we're out of time, but I'm gonna tell you these stories really quickly and then conclude. Napoleon himself, when he first invaded Egypt, this is sort of the early entry of colonialism, he brings a group of Arabists, Orientalists, to study the Muslim tradition, and they discover these hadiths. Hadith at the time that the Shuyukh of Azhar did not teach. They discover the hadith that you should obey whoever rules over you, and even if this person steals your power. And these hadiths were circulated by the Umayyads in response to the Alawis, the faction of Ali, and had been ignored in Islamic history for centuries, sort of deconstructed by various scholars. But Napoleon's Orientalist scholars rediscovered the hadiths and employed them in a manifesto. Napoleon claims to have converted to Islam. Most people don't know that, and claims that he came to Muslims as a liberator to liberate them from the despotism of the Mamluks and to overthrow the shackles of ubudiyya, of enslavement. And he circulates a manifesto reminding Muslims of this doctrine that was very popular in the Umayyad era, that you must obey a ruler even if that ruler is unjust and corrupt and so on, as long as they remain a Muslim. It didn't work, by the way, for Napoleon, because Napoleon had to execute an enormous number, and this is again because we don't know our history. We leave it to other people to write and construct, and unfortunately that's also why we lose our children Islamically. Napoleon had to execute a ridiculously large number of jurists because they would not give him the type of obedience that he wanted. And the idea that you obey regardless of the ethical connotations takes some time. It re-emerges with the Wahhabis very powerfully in the post-colonial era and so on. So this is the last word. Now, what can we conclude from this? Well, there is at the heart of a matter is an ethical dispute about political power. And at the thrust and the heart of the matter is the way that we negotiate ethical examples in our lives that might cost us in this world a great deal of privilege if we support these ethical examples. Eventually, what becomes Shiism adopts what, from my perspective and the perspective of scholarship, a very convenient mythology. The mythology that the Imam, in order for it to avoid the cycle of suffering, goes into occultation, initially goes into a minor occultation, and then later on into the major occultation, and that the Imam is living to return near the final days. I have to admit to you, that's something I don't believe. But, I respect those who believe it. In other words, even the Shia, what will become the Shia, reach a certain equation of musalama, or what's the word for musalama? Equation of appeasement with power in order to exist, in the notion of the occulted Imam. A fiction that allows them to finally not keep presenting martyrs generation after generation. What becomes the division is in Islamic history becomes seriously anchored when the factions that coalesced around the theological arguments of an occulted Imam managed to form political empires, the Fatimiyin in North Africa, and Egypt and North Africa, later on the Buwayhiyin, the Buwayhids in Iraq and Persia, and the Safawiyin, and the Safawiyin is from the 16th to the 18th century in Iran, in Persia. And like everything, when empires represent a Sunni paradigm, an empire represents a Shi'i paradigm, as in the Safawiyin in Iran and Persia. Like the politics we see between Saudi Arabia and Iran today, theology becomes grossly corrupted by politics. And the process of creating factions becomes so heavily influenced by the interests and manipulations of those in power. Now, for us American Muslims, we must understand that this is a long history, and a history about ethical issues and how you manage to reconcile politics and morality and ethics in your life. If we don't reflect upon this lesson, and if we don't extract wisdom from these lessons, not only has Imam Ali and Hassan and Hussein and all the other martyrs that followed them, not only, because these were not the only martyrs, we can't forget the Thawrat al-Zubair, the Waqa'at Ain al-Jamal. The Islamic history is full of rebellions against despotic rulers, and full of rebellions against colonial rulers, and full of rebellions in post-colonialism against rulers that were placed in power by colonial authorities. Then all of these sacrifices are for naught. And ultimately, we will reflect the same type of moral failure that so many suffer from. We have to think and have to figure a way to reconcile between ethical demands and the unethical nature of power. There's so much more I can say about this, but I'll stop here. Shall we pray or do we Yeah, that's what I'll let them.
Thank you so much. All right, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Dr. Khaled, for this beautiful and brilliant lecture. And it's time for the prayer. We're going to pray, and after the prayer, if you'd like to come, Dr. Khaled is going to be around. If you have any question, you can ask your questions. And as I said at the beginning, we're going to see him, inshallah, again on April 1st. Inshallah, we will see him more.
To continue the Q&A, please marshal back. Before we just one of the things that is rather painful is that throughout Islamic history, what united the Sunnah and Shia was their love for Ahlul Bayt. And if you grew up in any type of traditional Muslim society, whether Egypt or Syria or Indonesia or Nigeria, you will be aware of the numerous poems, literature, celebrations of Ahlul Bayt, and the moral example they gave unto Muslims. In the modern age, and I believe it's because of the influence of the Wahhabi movement, Allahu Alam, but I believe it's because of systematic influence of the Wahhabi movement. A lot of modern Muslims lose their touch and their appreciation of the moral example of the Ahlul Bayt, and by doing so, they make their sacrifices, the sacrifices that the early Bayt made, in order to provide an ethical example. And if you study the ethical example, it will blow your mind. It will blow your mind because it's truly profound. They lose that, and that's sad. I think modern Muslims, especially when you see how modern Muslims have failed to negotiate power constructively, it would behoove them to study that. Anyway, I'll answer a few questions. There was a question.
Why Imam Hussein decided military confrontation when he knew there was no chance against the powerful Yazid, Muawiyah, so on?
Well, this is a really good question because there are two more, and by the way, this is something that Muslim theologians have written so much on because we have two primary examples early on in Islamic history, right? Everyone agrees, including whether you're Sunni or Shi'i, that Yazid represented a despotic, corrupt power. And but first Imam Hassan gave priority to not spilling blood and negotiated with Muawiyah that Imam Hassan will drop the rebellion if Muawiyah promises to, once he dies, to return the issue of government to resolve the issue of government through election. That's what Imam Hassan negotiated with Muawiyah. That once you die, the Ummah, the nation, has to elect its own ruler. When Muawiyah, however, violates this agreement by, instead of giving government to an electoral process, he basically picks his own son, Yazid. And this puts Imam Hussein in a very tough moral position. You either accept the pragmatic realities of politics and negotiate with a reality that you think you know is ethically wrong. Either you accept the sovereignty of Yazid, as corrupt as he is, or in order to make a point, you sacrifice yourself in order to elevate or stand for a principle, even if the cost is your life. And we know from especially from the debates after Imam Hussein is massacred and his party is massacred, that the same issue was presented before in Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Whether Ja'far al-Sadiq, because he was asked to lead a rebellion, and Ja'far al-Sadiq refused to do so, and instead dedicated himself to teaching Sharia, teaching law. Now, this issue has filled so much of the debate, ethical debates, and modern Muslims don't realize how powerful our debates about ethics have been in history. When you confront something immoral, where you stand up to power, do you stand up to power, and even if the cost is everything, your life, your property, your family, in order to make a moral point? Or do you acclimate yourself to corrupt power by negotiating spaces for existence? Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's ultimately when you when you know that if you speak truth to power, it will crush you, and it will crush you savagely. Do you say, well, my job is to testify, as the Quran says, testify as to justice even if it's against yourself and your family and so on. So it's my job to testify, and even if the cost is the ultimate sacrifice, and I leave the moral lesson for generations to come, or is your duty to negotiate some type of accommodation with corrupt power? The very interesting thing, and again, I wrote a whole book about these debates because they're remarkably rich, was that Muslim jurists or Muslim scholars thought that the example of Imam Hussein was the morally superior example. That if you have the strength to stand up to injustice and sacrifice yourself, even if the cost is sacrificing yourself, and you truly understand that true life is the hereafter, not this life, and that life on this earth is a small sacrifice compared to the moral example you are setting, then if you have that strength, that is the more morally superior choice. But if you can't because of your own weaknesses, then you must pick what is a morally acceptable choice second to the ultimate choice of sacrifice. And that is why in the Alawi rebellion against the Umayyad despotism and Abbasid despotism, there was always this process by which always debate about, do we speak out against power without filters and let the sacrifice be the moral lesson to our children, or do we nuance our discourse? Now, what I think is really fascinating is that although you had various imams, practically the 10 after Hussein, negotiate something between rebellion and coexistence. In other words, they would bless rebellion when rebellion had a chance of making a moral point before it is snuffed out. Because you could rebel and be killed in secret and no one ever know about it, and then no moral point has been created. And continuing to teach the ethical example, because a lot of the narratives that they taught was about the corrupting impact of power and the importance of a life led by God's law rather than human will. Ultimately, though, power couldn't handle them, because ultimately each one of them ends being killed. And a lot of their followers repressed. It's a powerful, ongoing moral example as to what dissent is and living a purposeful, ethical life. And again, I want to emphasize this, that until the modern age, what divided the Sunnah and Shia was the belief in the occultation of the 12th Imam. But both Sunnah and Shia greatly celebrated the life of the Ahlul Bayt and celebrated their sacrifices. It is only in the Najdi period of Islam, the rise of the Wahhabi movement from Najd, in which the Ahlul Bayt suddenly are sidelined from the discourses of Sunni Muslims. So if you go to a lot of mosques today in the United States, you Sunni Muslim, you'll never hear anything about Ahlul Bayt. No one will ever talk about them. That's something quite new. That's not historically embedded. That's a very modern phenomenon, and a very problematic phenomenon in my view, because it really does divide the Sunnah and Shia then into nearly two different systems of belief, rather than a manageable disagreement over occultation and so on. And when do you take the calling? You do the calling of people. This is Grace, my wife, and she's the boss. So,
and she's doing a very good job.
She always tells me what to do, and I just follow.
I got a two-part question. The first one is that the Hadith, when you read the Sunni Hadith, it's 180 degrees from the Shia Hadith. That's one. Secondly, when you, what you are talking about past hour, when Yazid massacred the Hussein radiallahu anhu and his party, why most of the Muslims kept quiet? Why they did not take part with Hussein radiallahu anhu? This is just bothered me all my life. And that's those people, that the one that submitted to their corruption are the Sunnis. And the one that actually stood up for the rights and for the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, supposed to be Shia. Eventually it is exaggerated, a lot of things happened, we know, we don't want to get into that. So this is my question.
Okay, the first issue about Hadith, one of the primary difference between Sunni Hadith and Shia Hadith, or what became Sunni Hadith, is that the Shia preferred and gave priority to chains of transmission that come through the family of the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, and rejected certain narratives from particular companions like Abu Huraira. They rejected all the hadiths narrated by Abu Huraira. Sunnis, while you will find in the hadith plenty of transmissions through Ahlul Bayt, but they did not give preference to hadiths from Ahlul Bayt. Where the hadiths between Sunnis and Shia differ the most is exactly on the issue of Imam, because Shia sources report extensively about the incident of the pond of Ghadir, and when the Prophet ﷺ is supposed to have picked Ali as his successor. They'll differ about things relating to the relationship between Fatima and Umar ibn Khattab, for instance, or things like that. But what's remarkable is that when it comes to law, Islamic law, you find the Sunni and Shi'i jurisprudence remarkably similar. The Ja'faris and the Shafi'is are nearly identical, and Zaydis and Hanafis are nearly identical. So what's really amazing is that although a group starts out with the transmissions of Ahlul Bayt and another group starts out with the transmissions of the Sahaba, when it comes to so many issues of law, they end up in the same place. This suggests a great deal of cross-pollination throughout the histories of Sunnis and Shia. In other words, they influence each other immensely. And we know, for instance, that iconic figures in what becomes Shia Islam, like Ja'far al-Sadiq, was the teacher of what become iconic figures in what becomes Sunni Islam. So that division is not as clear-cut in history as it is now, because of the rise of political entities that further deepen that difference. The issue of the rebellion and the massacres of Imam Hussein, This was one of the critical moral questions that confronted early on Islam. Everyone recognized what will become the Sunnah and become the Shia, recognized that a great tragedy took place. Now remember that those who actually had the guts to join Imam Hussein's rebellion was a very small group. So even what will become later on the Shia, the vast majority of Muslims did not join the rebellion. And sat, I can't, it's too harsh to say idly by, but failed to support the moral party when the cost to morality was very high. If you read a lot of theological works, they say that this is precisely what Allah wanted to teach the Ummah. In having Imam Hussein, some even say that Imam Hussein predicted his own death and knew exactly that he's going to be massacred and so on, and that the whole point of this is to tell Muslims that unless you stand up for justice, then horribly unjust things will happen, and you will live with the consequences of your ethical failure for centuries. And I think later on, those who ritualized the moral failure in supporting Imam Hussein became the Shia. They developed rituals in Ashura and so on. And those who did not ritualize it but considered it a historical, you can't find a Sunni source in the classical age that doesn't talk about the murder of Imam Hussein as a great tragedy. And you can't find a Sunni source that doesn't say the sacrifice of the grandson of the Prophet was in order to tell Muslims that if you fail to stand up for justice, even that sacrifices could be so high, such as losing the Ahlul Bayt itself. But the answer to this, by the way, is that look at how hard it is. Imam Hussein is the metaphor, it's an example, it's the example he set for human beings, right? Look at how hard it is to follow his example in real life, in all types of situations. Look how hard it is to know that in the Muslim world there is a despotic ruler that commits a great deal of corruption, wastes the resources of the nation, and it's so hard to stand in opposition and risk being arrested and tortured. This happens in our life all the time. It is so hard if there's a demonstration going out to protest something that Trump did. It is so hard to go out and join this demonstration and risk being pepper sprayed or arrested and charged with whatever. It is so hard to stand up to pro-Israeli Zionist lobby organizations because you could lose your job. It is so hard to stand up to all types of moral causes. Now, if you internalize Imam Hussein's example, then the call upon you to stand up for justice, even if you will sacrifice a great deal, is a constant refrain. It's constantly in you. Imam Hussein's sacrifice is not about ritual. It's not about going to in Ashura and crying about what he did. It's about following his moral example. And I'll tell you personally, I'm not talking about other people, personally, it is very hard to follow his moral example because we all want a job, we all want a house, we all want privileges, we all want luxuries, and to that extent we are, there is a gap between us and what Imam Hussein did over and over and over and over throughout history. We had colonialism. What percentage of the population joined the rebellions against colonialism? Very small percentage. Sacrifice is hard. Sacrifice, becoming a shaheed, a bearer, a witness upon humanity. That's what shahada is. You know, people translate it as martyrdom. In Islam, it's actually you sacrifice to bear witness. It's a hard thing. It's a very demanding thing. And the hard thing is to do it in an ethical fashion. Those people who blow themselves up, they're cowards. Because they don't have to, what is hard is to suffer for your cause. To suffer deprivation and illness and denial and frustration. It's easy to just suicide, to commit a massive self-annihilation for your cause, because you don't have to live with the type of suffering that comes from standing up to ethical causes.
Let's, I'm going to have like 3 people say their questions so we can kind of see some time.
What would be the difference between Shia and Sunni in the area of the belief, deen, the area of their understanding of the Quran?
That was basically my question. I was asking the Sheikh if he could give us some insight. And we talked about the political differences between the two groups, but the religious differences and how they are, how can they, if ever, be reconciled? Which seems to me in this country where we're not actually fighting against each other, that's where the main chasm lies between the Shia and the Sunnis and the religious practices.
As I understand it from Islamic historical tradition, rebellion is usually meant to be, or it usually has been practiced publicly. What about, my question is about what are some notable instances, or if there are any notable instances of private rebellion that have now become known to us in Islamic tradition?
That's a good question.
I just was curious to know whether Shi'i or Sunni madhabs, or how those schools of thought were supported in terms of like finances, or if any. I was just curious to know how they gained their popularity.
Okay, well, these are good questions. First, the theological differences. Contrary to a lot of the jargon that is spread around, the Shia and the Sunni have the same Quran. The notion that sometimes in a sinister way passed into Shia communities and repeated by some Shia that there was a Quran of Fatima and that it was suppressed and so on and so forth. This mythology had ebbed, been erased in Islamic history, and then it disappears and then it returns, and it's usually in response to political conflicts more than anything. But historically, it's the same Quran. There have never emerged a different copy of the Quran among the Shia than the Quran used by the Sunnah. Now, where there is a big difference is that the Shia theology and tafsir books, a number of Quranic verses are interpreted to reference Haqqiyat Ali, or that Ali was supposed to be the successor. And so the interpretation of the Quran, especially on the issues having to do with the successor of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to power, that's where you find quite a bit of disagreements, differences. But other than that, tafsir books in the Sunni and Shi'i world are remarkably similar. I've read so many of them. And it is the issue of imama where there's a considerable amount of difference. Now, other than that, the same Quran, different interpretive dynamics. Prayer is the 5 prayers. The Shia pray. They have the option actually but a lot of Shia don't realize the jurisprudential debates within their own tradition, that they have the option of praying Dhuhr and Asr together and Maghrib and Isha together. So, and they base that on the fact that the Quran references 3 times for prayer. And so they say if the Quran, everyone agrees, Sunni and Shia, that there are 5 prayers. What they disagree on is the fact that the Quran references 3 times for prayer, so they say that means Dhuhr and Asr are together and Isha and Maghrib are together, while the Sunnis say no, the fact that the Quran references 3 times for prayer can only be interpreted in light of Hadees that did not come from Ahlul Bayt but came through the Sahaba, which says 5 separate times for 5 prayers. Ramadan is the same, where because of the accumulation of history, there are various ritualistic aspects in which you will find a clear distinction between Sunni and Shi'i practices. Now, a lot of Shia, like a lot of Sunnah, will repeat rituals without really knowing why they do them, or what their history is, where they emerged from. So that's one thing. One of the issues that unfortunately has been marshaled by every time there are political parties that want to deepen the divide between Sunnah and Shia, and I've seen this with through my own personal experience so many times. There will be this emphasis that the Shia cuss or curse or condemn the companions of the Prophet, or some of the companions, Umar, Abu Bakr, and so on, Aisha, and when people, the certain parties want to get Sunnis all heated up against the Shia, and get them excited to persecute the Shia, there will be an emphasis on, the Shia curse the companions of the Prophet, and they will always point to the same passages in books like Bahar al-Anwar, and so on. Now, my own position on this is that the cursing of companions started out because of the Umayyad practice of cursing Ali. And as a reaction to this, there was a counter-cursing. You find in Shia sources, and I can reference you to books like Al-Lumma Dimashqiyya and Istinsar, Kitab al-Istinsar, and so on, where within Shia theology, the Shia jurists are told that it's a bad practice to curse a companion, and that even though Ali used to be cursed on podiums of mosques, that it is sinful to respond to the cursing of a companion through counter-cursing. But, these types of texts are often ignored in the midst of these sectarian political divides. My own position is that the history of cursing or counter-cursing must be understood as a complex historical dynamic that we can negotiate to mend injuries and heal deep fissures rather than perpetuate them. So, if in fact, let's assume that in fact Umar and Abu Bakr and so on were cursed by, it is incumbent upon contemporary Muslims to say, let's open a new page. There is no grounds for cussing out or cursing, not just companions, but anyone. Let's agree to end that practice, and let's focus on respecting each other's belief. Some Sunnis believe in the Mahdi, not the Imam al-Ghaib, but Mahdi coming in the end of days. Shia believe in an Imam al-Ghaib, whether it's the 7ers or the 12ers or the present Imam if you're Ismaili or whatnot. We will never resolve these differences, but we can refrain from actions that are antagonistic to each other, like speaking ill of historical figures that did their best and died. It is never moral, in my view, to kill each other or to oppress each other because of history or the condemnation of historical figures. So I see what unites Sunnis and Shi'is as far more significant than what divides them. Now, about how institutionally they developed, the Shia existed as a persecuted minority throughout centuries. Even when they managed the Ismaili branch of the Shia, which believed in the present Imam instead of an occulted Imam, established itself in North Africa and built the Fatimid dynasty, they separated themselves from the Ja'faris and the Zaydis. In other words, they were not a pro-Shia empire in North Africa, but rather just simply pro-Ismaili, pro-Fatimid empire, which was eventually overthrown. What is quite remarkable about the Shi'i minority is that they would always appoint a da'i, a figure, to go around to converts to the Shi'i cause or loyalists to the Shi'i cause, to the party of Ahlul Bayt, and collect the khums tax, the one-fifth tax. And with that tax, various institutions of awqaf and of learning were built. These institutions became so significant that eventually they played a critical role in the birth of the Buwayhid Shi'i Empire and the Safavid Shi'i Empire. But the way the Shia survived through history is through the collection of that tax by secretly designated members who would literally have a list, and I can tell you so many stories where the political authorities of the Umayyads and the Abbasids would try to find out the tax collector. And if they captured him, they would torture him for the list of contributors, because that would tell them who were no one knew who the Shia were. They were always kept it secret. And the Imam and his representatives would have the full record, but various political authorities through the Umayyads and Abbasids they would always try to, through spies, by the way, it's sort of very exciting James Bond stories. There would always be spies. The spies would try to find out the tax collector. Once they find out the tax collector's name, they arrest them and tortured to give them a list of the followers of Ahlul Bayt. And this happened over and over and over in history. The remarkable thing is that the conviction in their cause was so powerful that it continued on. It was never snuffed out, and eventually these financial institutions were able to support the building of political empires representing Shia theology. Most prominently in the Safavid Empire in Persia. Now, the issue of private rebellion is fascinating because there is a very long tradition in which the way you resist power, and I think that played a critical role in the survival of Shiism rather than its extermination like some other sects in Islamic history, is that you don't rebel through an armed rebellion, but you refuse to cooperate. And we have so many of the figures that became important in the birth of Shia theology later on, but so many of the figures that represented Ahlul Bayt, the cause of Ahlul Bayt, their rebellion was not through an armed rebellion, but rather a refusal to, passive resistance. It was a refusal to cooperate. And the refusal to cooperate bothered, I mean, just to give you one example, Ma'mun, who was an Abbasid caliph, wanted the cooperation of Ahlul Bayt because of their popularity, so much so that he takes the representative of Ahlul Bayt, brings him to Baghdad, and then says, I will designate you as my wali al-ahd, as my deputy, my vice president, the one that would take power after I die. He refuses, and because he refuses, he is imprisoned until eventually he says, the Ma'mun tells him, you know, whether you like it or not, I'm designating you. And I'm releasing you from prison, because during his imprisonment, he became ever more popular. And his governors told Ma'mun that by imprisoning him and torturing him, you've actually increased his popularity. So he eventually releases him with that title, which I'm trying to remember who was it that, yeah, it was Ali ibn Musa al-Rida. So al-Rida, refuses this title as vice president. Ma'mun insists that he has that title as vice president. Eventually he releases him from prison and says, go home, keep in mind you're the vice president. Al-Rida says, okay, I will go home, but I am no vice president. I'm going to just teach my students as I always do in private. Well, he continued to do that and continued to refuse to issue fatwas that Al-Ma'mun wanted him to issue, and continued to issue statements about the unjust practices of Al-Ma'mun's governors. That became so irksome to Ma'mun that he eventually poisoned him. And Rida knows that it's a matter of time before Ma'mun kills him. And he says to his students and his family, the minute he insisted on making me the vice president, he signed my death warrant, because he can't afford to keep me alive. His own family, who wants to inherit rule, his wife and their children, won't want me continue living. And the nature of power is that it tries to co-opt you, and if you're not co-optable, it crushes you. So, Rida, shortly after making this rather famous essay, or writing it and reading it to his students, he is killed. And it's a fascinating dynamic that continued. This someone, I don't know his name, a young man came up to me and asked me, well, if the imams kept being put to death through poisoning, after he poisoned a couple of the first two, why didn't they do something to protect themselves? And the answer is, it's a really good question. They saw their own martyrdom as a fundamental part of their message, because we have a repeated pattern with the imams who'd say, we know that it's only a matter of time before power can't afford to have us around, Because you have to remember that they were always representing counter-power positions. They were always pro-poor. They were always condemned aristocracy and its excesses. They were always critical of the military and its expeditions and its invasions. They were always critical of the system of Mawali, which was a system of sponsorship for converts, which the Ahlul Bayt saw as a betrayal of the Islamic cause, that a convert must have a native sponsor. They saw the system of sponsorship as a means of corruption. And by constantly symbolically standing for that, they cite their death knell every single time. Sometimes, you know, the only moral thing to do is die for your cause, not live for your cause, but the trick is to do it without hurting anyone else, and that's exactly what they did. They sacrificed themselves without exterminating or annihilating anyone else. It's a very powerful moral example. I mean, it's sad that Islam, in the light of Wahhabism, ignores the moral example of Ahlul Bayt to the point that I've surveyed Sunni publications since the 70s and found very few, there were only 2 or 3 Sunni publications on Ahlul Bayt. Now compare that to the number of publications about Ahlul Bayt from the 19th century up to the 1960s, which I tracked hundreds of them. That's a serious loss for us. You know, we need to reflect on that moral example, because it's a moral example of resisting power. We have the example of Hussein, and then we have the example of all the other imams who resisted power without violence and sacrificed themselves in acts of resistance.
Are you okay to do a few more?
Yeah.
So we've got a few more.
Why the difference between the Shia and Sunni inherit, and even you have to believe in the Quran from page 1 to the last, in Surah An-Nisa. Why the Shia, you know, inherited different than the Sunni?
Oh, the inheritance of Miras?
The 3 main positions that they had to choose from and take different paths, the first, the middle, and the last. What I understood, the last one, was it the Wahhabi movement, that I can now interpret it as a political movement to deepen the division between the first and the second, and make it so historical to gain their own profit, supporting the corrupt.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take this question first and then go to the first one. It's not just the Wahhabis. I mean, there was a movement, the Ahl al-Hadees before the Wahhabis, and then the Hanbalis, and then what became the Wahhabis later on in history. They're represented at one point by Ibn Taymiyyah, and they, for a variety of reasons, they were virulent in their hostility to the Shia. And considered, and it's the critical issue that inspired their animosity towards the Shia. And not just the Shia, by the way, it was the Shia and the Sufis, is the issue of intercession. This very puritanical orientation that rejected even the intercession of the Prophet, the Shafa'a, and rejected the intercession of Imams, and rejected the intercessions of awliya. It was never popular in Islamic history until the Wahhabi movement. That's a point that I'm making, is that it existed, it always was there, but it never became a mainstream position. So if you would have been raised in Islam 100 years ago, you would find the idea that you go ask for the intercession of pious individuals, of awliya, of imams, a common one. It would not at all surprise you. It would be sort of the mainstream. The anti-intercession position made the Wahhabis virulently anti-Sufi and anti-Shia. But the irony in it is also what they care about is a particular understanding of Tawheed and avoidance of shirk. And as long as they get the understanding of Tawheed and avoidance of shirk, there are no further ethical issues to unpack. It's as if, as long as you learn how to pray, how to fast, how to follow the didactic Sunnah, using a miswak, how do you drink water in 3 sips, you drink while sitting instead of standing, how to go to the bathroom. And as long as you learn these ritualistic aspects, all the ethical issues don't matter. So put it this way, the Wahhabi thrust was that justice is not an issue. What is an issue is Tawheed. And so you don't think about justice, and justice is never a question that is problematized in Wahhabi theology. So, it's far more important that you understand that there's Tawheed al-Uluhiyya and Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, and that you learn how to say the Tawheed correctly, how to do your Salah correctly, how to do your fasting correctly, how to go to the bathroom correctly. But it is not at all important to think about issues of justice, ethics, morality, and what bothered them is the indeterminacy that they found among, and the sort of complexity they found among Sufi groups and Shia groups, because the narratives about power and injustice and your obligation to witness on behalf of God. So in Wahhabi theology, there's nothing, no writings about witnessing on behalf of God, that famous ayah that you must bear witness for God even if it's against yourself, and so on. Nothing is said about it. It's not really rendered a moral obligation. And in fact, you have an obligation to obey the ruler as long as the ruler recognizes proper tawheed. That's all that's needed. So, one of the remarkable things is that the Wahhabi movement started out with a huge massacre of the Shia committed in Najaf and the Shia of Arabia. A lot of people forget that Arabia itself, South Arabia, had for centuries a huge Shia population in the millions. Wahhabis, when they rose in Najd, when they confronted the Shia populations of Arabia, they massacred them. And even the Imams that were buried in Medina, their grave sites have been destroyed. You don't find them in Medina anymore. You can't visit their grave sites anymore, because several of them were buried in Medina. That deepened the divide between the Sunnah and Shia, because if you don't allow the Shia to perform pilgrimage according to their own rituals, if you consider them heretics worse, a greater threat on Islam than anyone else, if you deepen their persecution rather than elevate it and rather than lift it and mitigate it, it's no surprise that the divide and what we see going on in Yemen now and so on is taking place. I forgot what the other thing was. Oh, the inheritance. That's, I mean, the Sunni and Shi'i inheritance is actually not that different. What's different is the wasiyah. And what has become known in the modern age and as the Shia position has actually been also adopted by a number of Sunni jurists, very prominent jurists, that and so it's a difference over interpretation and over acceptance of certain hadiths or historical incidents that were reported by Ahlul Bayt but was rejected by Sunni Hadith transmitters. And even, I'm hesitant to say that because not all Sunni Hadith transmitters. So I don't think the inheritance is a matter of legal interpretation. It's very complicated because it goes into the nitty-gritty of legal evidence and legal debate. And what people think is a Shia position is actually represented within the Sunni school by several Sunni jurists as well. When someone asks me about this, I give them all the options, I told them what the evidence is, and then I tell them, you decide what you want to follow. Okay. And I don't mention that this is the Shia or Sunni, I just tell them the various positions of various fuqaha about the matter and what they base their evidence on. And that's often what accounts for the differences in legal interpretation.
So last grouping, okay, so you.
I have a question.
And okay, so can you handle all of those? I'll just let them ask
Okay.
the question and leave it to you.
I have some health impediments, so Grace is always worried that
It's okay, just.
I extend myself and then crash. So that's why she's asking me if you can handle all of this.
It's a tiny question and it's not if we can answer it any time.
No, it's okay.
I can really wait. It's not actually a question,
Let's
it's,
ask.
it's just I'm wondering if how you feel about getting Shiite mosques and Sunni mosques together instead of only having interfaith groups and to use group and solve their problems first together and make a point of saying that the difference between us is so tiny that we shouldn't have it like a political issue, and at the same time it would counter a little bit the influence of the Wahhabi movement all over the world that most of us don't swallow at all.
Like, could you have a speech like this in a Shiite mosque?
Yeah. I'll comment on it.
Very quick question, and
Oh, wait just a second. I'm going to bring the microphone up to you. Go ahead.
Thank you, brother. This is a very enlightening experience. I have a few questions, maybe not many, but I'd like to elaborate on the fact. I want you to elaborate on the fact that is in Hajjat al-Wada for the Prophet addressing certain issues. If you elaborate on that one, when you refer out to the modern Muslims, what exactly are you saying? What is it? The third question for you is the dialogue between Sunni and Shia has actually started, and if it not, if there's any mechanism of how we can bridge that gap, that is Christian, Protestant, or Catholic, they were separated for so many years, but can we learn from that experience in order to deploy a new era for our generation to bridge that gap and stay away from the political end of it, try to bring a good generation that is actually sustainable for the future of our kids. That's it. Thank you.
I don't know if
my quick question, Sheikh, everybody question very intellectual. I'm a very layman, I have no enough knowledge in Islam. But I have a brother, he has studied Quran so many times he claims, and we are very good brother and friend. He says only Quran has to follow. Sometimes he have a condemnation about Hadith because Hadith been written after 300 years. People from the Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, like Bukhari, maybe correct or not, Hadith don't have to believe, he said. So I have a very sad listening from him. This I want you to very shortly you say Hadith to follow or not. Secondly, the Imam, nothing mentioned in the Quran because Quran revealed many years before the Imam came. Do we have to believe in Imam? And also another word when you say Ahle Bayt, what is the word mean by Bayt? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, I want to thank the Sheikh Khaled, and I think he's very well a scholar, and may God really give Jazahullah kulla khair. But now we claim that we seek justice, and you know, as a Muslim observer, to do justice to the Wahhabis. You know, the Wahhabi built all their religion on one verse, where God says God will forgive every sin except shirk. So they went from there and they tried to avoid shirk. And then as the previous brother said, you know, Ahl al-Bayt, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran 13 times said, obey God and obey the Prophet. Obey God, but he never say obey God, obey the Prophet, and obey Ahl al-Bayt. So, you know, to exaggerate the value of Ahl al-Bayt, which is in the, you know, beyond the sky, you know, is good, but it's not compulsory. Not from the Quran point of view lens.
Do you have a question that you want to ask?
So, I want to clear, because, you know, we don't want to try Wahhabis in absentia, you know. We have to be fair. Thank you.
Okay.
Did you have sorry, one last one. Sorry, I'm going to watch the answers.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Khaled, for giving us this lecture. I'd actually like to second that sort of question, or I echo the same question about the defining the modern or mainstream Muslim, as you've talked about in your text as well. And the other is a little bit more lighthearted. So over, you know, the dinner table or over coffee, when talking about Shia and Sunni, a lot of the times the subject sort of gets heated. So I guess if you were to give some advice as to talking about, you know, Shia and Sunni, as you have done here in the sense of like subsets of one tradition versus like, you know, sometimes people get heated as much as talking about the Shia as some sort of like kafir sect or something. So it's just sort of, I guess, strategies to dispel that tension and things to say that would sort of stick. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good questions. Okay, so first, I think it is critical for Muslims in the West to figure out a way not to import the ethnic, nationalistic, and sectarian divides from their countries of origins to the West. Consistently and systematically, we have to understand that there is a great deal of money and effort and a very concerted campaign and very well funded by people from certain ideological standpoints that wants to make sure, you know, represented by the word Islamophobia, that want to make sure to neutralize the effect of Muslims in the West, whether Europe or the US. And they revel in, when they see Muslims unable, they revel in the divisions that exist between Muslims, or when Muslims attack each other and distract themselves from the real existential threat. And that's, the type of racism that we see against Muslims in France, the type of racism that we saw in Trump's election and in the Republican parties. Imagine when you leave, you forget about the racism and the bigotry and the hatred that we see from so many politicians in America and in Europe, and we somehow forget about that and become engulfed in some debate about the Sunni and Shia. It's disastrous. It's the effect of that is disastrous. But one of the things that I'm actually very happy I did in my life is that I had acquired the colonial record, literally the office, the correspondence of the British colonial office during the colonial period. In other words, this is their written record in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century. And and this is in a book called Reasoning with God, where I wrote about that record. And I went through and read what the colonial agents were telling each other about ruling over Muslim countries. And time and again, they talk very openly about that in order to dominate Muslims, you have to divide them. And they talk very openly about that and very clearly and purposefully about it. So, now I have to tell you, I have been invited to a lot of Shia institutions. I've spoken at Khoury Foundation, for instance, in DC. Because Sunnis are a majority and because I was born as a Sunni, so I don't really identify myself either as a Shia or Sunni. I do identify myself with the Shafi'i mazhab, for whatever that's worth. That's because I've been trained to follow the Shafi'i mazhab. The majority has a moral obligation to reach out to the minority and to elevate their fears and anxieties. And so I've spoken in a lot of Shia mosques and Islamic centers, and I think it's a really good idea to create something beyond. When I first came to the United States, by the way, one of the things that really impressed me was that in the youth group, where I first met Salam al-Muriati, for instance, Salam was born to Shia parents, but he wasn't aware of, his own Shiaism was not an issue. And that was beautiful. The fact that as Muslims in the United States, we're not anchored in a Shia or Sunni identity. But what is really unfortunate is when we see American Muslims start being infected by the type of sectarian nonsense where you start seeing very hateful talk directed against each other. And that's disastrous for. We cannot afford it as American Muslims because we already are at a very existential threat. I'm sure you realize most of our children, we're praying that they grow up Muslim. We're praying that by the time they're married and so on, they have not lost their Islam, and our attrition rates are ridiculous. So I see this issue as a sort of a serious, vulnerable point that we must be very smart about. Now, remember that there was a very concerted effort in the Islamic world called Dawat al-Taqrib, which was led by Azhar and Indian scholars. This was in the beginning of the 20th century up to the 1960s, of creating these dialogues between Shia and Sunni scholars and attempting to reach a consensus of a pluralist consensus of we agree to disagree upon certain things. And Da'wat al-Taqrib, Azhar used to publish volumes, which are in my library, used to publish volumes documenting the minutes of the conferences and meetings between the Shia and Sunni scholars. And there were Sunni scholars that would come from, because Sunni and Shi'i scholars in India, for instance, have coexisted for a very long time. Same for Arabia before the rise of the Wahhabi movement, and so on. But unfortunately, Da'wat al-Taqrib comes through an abrupt end after the rise of Saudi influence in the late 60s and early 70s. I knew personally several of the Shuyukh al-Azhar that were involved in Da'wat al-Taqrib, and I can tell you, what they told me about the way that political interests brought a very abrupt end to, so it's the attempt between Shia and Sunnah to reach a reconciliation, to reach some type of mending of the fences, if you will, an appeasement or an accommodation, a pluralist solution, is not that novel. It actually has, among some of the very fascinating things is that there's a tradition in Islam where Shia jurists become certified in Sunni law, and where Sunni jurists become certified in Shia law. So for instance, I trained in Shia law under an Ayatollah and received my ijaza in Jafari law, studying with an Ayatollah. There's nothing inconsistent in that, because you are learning diversity, you're learning different ways to understand the majesty of Allah and the beauty of the Islamic tradition. Now, is that common? Yes, it was common pre-1970s, pre-rise of Wahhabi movement. It was not at all, what I did is not at all noteworthy before that time. There is a book by a fellow called Devin Stewart about the tradition of Shia jurists training in a Sunni jurist in Sunni law and receiving their ijazas in Sunni law. And there's a wonderful actually tradition where Sunni jurists would help preserve the Shi'i Hadith tradition and vice versa. It's a remarkable historical institution. So, yeah. Now, the questions are a little bit, widespread, so I'm trying to integrate them as much as I can. Hujjat al-Wada', this is the final sermon given by the Prophet ﷺ in the last pilgrimage of his life. And he gives a very famous sermon known as Hujjat al-Wada', in which he gives Muslims his sort of final will and testament. And part of the theological / historical debate is that in Shia's chains of transmission, they insist that in the last sermon, the Prophet says that Ali is my wali, while Sunni sources deny that the Prophet mentions Ali in the last sermon. Now, is there a historical way we can resolve this? I don't think so. Do we know whether the Prophet mentions Ali as his wali in the last sermon? Or for that matter, in the Pond of Ghadir as the... I don't think you can resolve it. It really boils down to, you can read the history and adopt whatever you want to believe, but we must as Muslims, respect the belief of the other on such critical existential issues. To demonize the other in this context is very problematic. Now, I want to address this issue of shirk and Ahlul Bayt and so on. Yes, what inspired Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was the notion of the verse that Allah forgives all sins but does not forgive shirk. But the problem with Muhammad Abdul Wahhab's message was that he thought that he understood this verse more than any other Muslim in centuries of Islam. In fact, the thrust of his message was that shirk is widespread all over the Muslim Ummah. And he identified shirk in those who visit graves, those who have shrines, those who have pictures, those who play chess, those who play music. In his famous treatise, he creates a list of things that would make you fall into shirk. Our problem with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is not his doctrine of anti-shirk, or associating partners with God. That's not the issue. Our problem is with his practice of takfir, calling those who he thinks practice shirk kuffar. Our problem is the fact that the early Wahhabis massacred Sufis, rationalists or jurists. We have a historical record of Ottomans, the Turks, who they considered kuffar. They in a blanket fashion, declared all Ottomans to be kuffar. And they killed numerous Muslims, and we have the historical record of the head of the Maliki madhab, the head of the Hanafi madhab, sending these letters to authorities in Egypt saying that the Najdis are putting the jurists to death, asking them a bunch of questions, and if you give the wrong answer, you're killed. Our problem was the fact that the Wahhabis destroyed Islamic shrines and historical sites because they considered it all to be shirk. We saw that later on with what the Taliban did in Afghanistan. We saw that with ISIS, what they did in a lot of historical sites in Syria and Iraq. But the genesis was what the Wahhabis did with the homes and the grave sites of the Sahaba and Ahlul Bayt, and that's our problem. The problem is that when they took over Hijaz, they no longer allowed Sufi tariqas to exist in Hijaz. There are no Sufi tariqas in Hijaz. For centuries there were. Hijaz used to be the most diverse area of all of Islam. Everyone was represented in Hijaz. All the different schools of thought, all the tariqas, all the people would report in their travel logs about the wonders of learning circles in Hijaz. You would go and you could be exposed to the Mu'tazila, you could be exposed to the Ash'aris, to the Maturidiyas, you could be exposed to every Sufi tariqah because everyone had a representative in Hijaz. When the Najdis took over Hijaz, they destroyed all of that. They streamlined Islam so that it fits their concept of shirk. And they have a very narrow concept of shirk. And the practice of takfir, when, for instance, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab creates this list where he says, Al-Razi is a kafir, and Al-Amidi is a kafir, and he lists Tabari as a kafir. It's in his book. Go read it. When Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's brother writes a very famous risala where he condemns his own brother, telling him, you are corrupting Islam and changing its nature forever because you think you have an exclusive claim to what Tawheed is. Who do you think you are? That is our problem with the Wahhabis. It's not, we don't like their name, we don't. Today, my problem was, I mean, I'm not sure who represents the Wahhabis today anymore. I honestly don't, because I don't know if Saudi Arabia represents the Wahhabis anymore. I mean, Saudi Arabia represents power for a ruling family called Al Saud. Right? But I don't know who they represent other than that. When I look at what they do with the Palestinians, when I look at what they do with the Israelis, when I look at their reaction to the disaster in Jerusalem, I mean, people, wake up, Jerusalem. We can't put our claim to Jerusalem as Muslims. We have a historical, moral, theological claim, and then we watch the consortium led by Saudi and the Emirat and Egypt basically say, oh, go ahead, take it. We worried about when they turn Mecca into Las Vegas, a place of wealth. If you don't have money and you go to Mecca, you're going to sleep in the street. I remember the old Mecca. It wasn't like that. It wasn't a place for the rich. Then you want me to be nice to the Wahhabis? I'm sorry. They've hurt me too often. I try to be nice to everyone. But when I see the Wahhabis have destroyed our historical sites, don't even allow me to know where the homes and the mosques of the companions of the Prophet. As to Ahlul Bayt, remember that the Quran does mention Ahlul Bayt, and that it does talk about that Allah wants to purify Ahlul Bayt and elevate them. So the Wahhabis, their oblivion towards Ahlul Bayt is an aberration in Islamic history. It's an aberration. But you know what? Because of their oil money, they've succeeded. Most of us are not raised reading Nahj al-Balagha anymore or Sahif al-Sajjadiyya anymore. What you must know that Sunnis used to read, Nahj al-Balagha was printed in Sunni Egypt and Sunni India numerous times. I read my first Nahj al-Balagha with a Sunni sheikh, because it is a record of Imam Ali, and Imam Ali's moral teaching. If you haven't read Nahj al-Balagha, you are missing out on amazing ethical lessons. We don't teach it to our children. We don't, because we've been told that if you pay attention to Ahlul Bayt, somehow you're taking the sides of Shia. And that's my problem. That's a huge problem.
Yes.
Okay, what am I missing out? Oh, the Qur'ani, this thing about not following hadith and so on. This is called the Qur'aniyun phenomena. And by the way, it's not new in Islam. There was 1,200 years ago a movement, it's actually led by rationalists, by philosophers, to only follow the Qur'an and reject the hadith. Ibn Khaldun says something very I like about the hadith. He says, Ibn Khaldun is a famous historian / jurist from North Africa, that the hadith must be read through the lens of rationality and reason, not solely through the lens of transmission.
Allah.
The Qur'aniyun commit a grave injustice. It's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They find a lot of hadiths that are problematic, because there are a lot of hadiths. If you read through Bukhari and so on, you find a lot of hadiths that strikes you as immoral and cannot be correct. So for instance, in the hadith in Bukhari that says in the final day, Allah will take from the sins of Muslims and dump them onto Christians and Jews. You read a hadith like that, and I don't care what the chain of transmission is. It cannot be. It's Muslim. It cannot be correct. And they're the types of hadiths, by the way, that the Islamophobes pounce on. Because I can tell you, the Islamophobes paid people handsomely. Because if you're Muslim, there's never money for anything. Muslims, alhamdulillah, they save their money, they buy cars, they buy Whatever they buy, they're very good about consumption. Best consumers in the world. But they never support education, knowledge, scholars, so on. Alhamdulillah. But non-Muslims who have a Jewish Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA, while Islamic studies is nothing, typical, classic, because Jewish families spend to support their cause. Muslims like to sit on their butt and complain all the time and then go spend on food and cars and homes and traveling back home and sending their uncles and aunts presents and all that crap. Anyway, what was I talking about? How did I get here?
You were talking about the funds, the money that's being spent.
Oh yes, the money. So the Islamophobes actually spend people to go through Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Dawood, Ibn Majah, and find all the hadiths that are problematic and put it in books and said, this is Islam. That's why you have some Muslims react to this by saying, we just follow the Quran. What the Islamophobes ignore and what the Quraniyun ignore is that in the same way there are hadiths that are very ethically problematic, there is hadiths that anchor our ethical universe. You can't approach a hadith with a hack. You have to be a surgeon. So for instance, when the hadith, also in Bukhari, that says, whoever knows himself knows his God. If you reject the hadith, you reject moral, ethical insights like that. من عرف نفسه عرف ربه. A profoundly reflective hadith, or even the hadith al-asl wara al-zimma, that the presumption always is the presumption of innocence. I mean, how can we do without that? It's a profound moral, ethical stand that you are always presumed innocent unless proven otherwise. That comes from hadith. But there's no question, there's a lot of hadiths that are misogynistic, that are inconsistent with Quranic morality and so on. And the key is not to leave it to the Islamophobes to go through our hadith books and malign us. The key is for us to go through our own hadith books and differentiate between what our Prophet could have in fact taught and what are clearly corruptions in the tradition. So that's my response about this hadith issue. Remember also that the hadith tradition, and this is something that scholars spend a lot of time on, were motivated by historical conflicts. So a lot of the hadith that have to do with politics and power, they were actually circulated by people in power. And part of what a scholar does is to figure out what were the historical motives behind certain hadiths and how they could have come into circulation. And you have to approach this as a surgeon, with a sort of a scalpel, because tradition could empower people. People without tradition are a lost people. But people weighed down with a corrupt tradition are an oppressed people. So you have to strike that balance between oppression and being uprooted and without an anchor. So you need to anchor yourself in your tradition, but not anchor yourself in something within the tradition that is foul, corrupting, immoral. And again, this goes back to, we cannot afford theologies that that exclude so much of the history and identity of Islam that, for instance, begins its process of definition by saying Sufis are kuffar, or the Shia are kuffar, or the Mu'tazila are kuffar. These takfiri theologies are a disaster, and I think they empowered all types of domination of Muslims, because they ultimately spend Muslim energies into, and they alienate our children, by the way, because our children, when they see takfir left and right, they get confused and they say, screw it, we'll go do something fun. And then we have a very hard time keeping them within the tradition. Okay, it's 3 o'clock. This always happens when I talk at the center. We end up doing something that the center never does. I don't think the center, I think Asim is left, right?
Asim had another appointment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Barakallahu feek.